Hello, my name's Daniel Sweetser, and I'm reading through a book I just finished up, Hope Starts Small, and I'm going to read through Chapter 2, Part 1. Chapter 2, Sprouts. Chapter 2, Part 1, Starting Small. In the fall of 2022, Frank and Constance decided to move from their house in town to a place with more land where they could start a homestead. At the time, Frank decided to start the process of planting his field. He wanted to start from seed, so he bought seeds online after looking up different varieties and deciding on Echo and Chandler. The packets said that the seeds needed to be cold stratified, so he took some of them and placed them in a folded damp paper towel sprinkled with cinnamon, and then carefully set them in the back of the refrigerator. At the same time, he started some seeds immediately, in case they took without the additional time in the cold. The seeds were surprisingly small, so small, in fact, that he could only manage them with tweezers. And even then, it was difficult to grab just one seed. He planted a handful of them in peat moss pellets. He put them in a tray on top of the china cabinet in their dining room, and he waited. He and Constance then began two concerted efforts. The first was the cleaning and clearing of excess junk in their house, and the second was searching for a new home. The housing market at the time was crazy, and so Frank and Constance were having a difficult time finding a fit. Constance's mom lived with them, and they wanted to ensure that wherever they went would have a semi-dedicated space for her. And of course, they wanted land, as much as they could manage. But they had a self-imposed constraint that they wanted to do this without going into substantial debt. That part drove their realtor friend crazy. He would find a seemingly perfect fit, but it would require a large mortgage, and this was something that Frank and Constance had no interest in. This, combined with the reality that no house at the time was being sold for asking price, made the whole affair incredibly difficult. They looked at one house after another. One was very old, but it had a place for Constance's mom, and it had some land. It would have meant a garden, not a field, and this made Frank sad, but they put in an offer anyway, only to have it be overwhelmed by the competition. They did not get that house. They found another where the ceilings were rotting, and they almost talked themselves into being able to fix it because it had a nice big yard for planting. But then they discovered the bowing foundation in the back under the garage, and that settled things. That house still sold quickly and above asking price. All the while, Frank had been watching those planted seeds above the china cabinet. And like a surprise birthday party, one day a little green sprout emerged. Then another, and another. Suddenly, Frank was a blueberry dad. When the first sprouts emerged, Frank was over the moon. He had a picture of himself holding the first little ones, beaming. Of course, he had no clue what he was getting himself into, much like a new dad holding their baby in the hospital. But that particular moment was sublime. Frank soon planted more seeds and began to collect little sprouts all over the dining room. He set the little ones up by the window to get as much of the short winter sun as they could. Each sprout continued to grow, vibrant, beautiful, simple, and Frank cared for them as best he knew how, watering them and watching them with delight as they grew. And as they grew, his heart began to make room for these little ones. He began to delight in them, like treasures, like friends. The house search was going poorly. Frank and Constance began to realize that their offer was simply not competitive as it stood. Others were offering cash, and Frank and Constance had a contingency of having to sell their home. This put them at a disadvantage right away, and then to add to this, they were rarely the highest bid either. They hit a low point when they looked at a possible home with no yard, filled with mold, and walked away knowing they weren't even competitive for this place. Their realtor told them that day something that they needed to hear. They would need to sell their own house first and have cash in hand if they wanted to have any chance of finding a place to put down roots. Frank and Constance agreed, knowing that this meant they would need to take more drastic measures to prepare their own home to sell, and they would need to make contingency plans in case they could not find a new place right away. There were many big questions without answers, but if they really wanted to move, they would need to do this. So Frank and Constance drove home that day, reeling from the realization of what they would need to do next. As soon as they got home, Frank began to get the house ready to show. The great emptying. He worked that day and then the next. He took anything non-essential, furniture, toys, decor, and moved it to the basement. On the second night, he went to check on the seeds that he had kept in the refrigerator. He discovered then that all of the seeds had suddenly germinated. They could no longer stay there, so he found himself having to populate nearly 100 peat moss pellets, many of which contained more than one sprout. He found an out-of-the-way place in the house and set up all the sprouts on trays. He had a grow light from a prior failed hydroponics experiment, which he set up for the sprouts to supplement a lack of direct sunlight. And so it was that the day after they decided to sell their home first before finding another, Frank and Constance were suddenly inundated by the beginnings of a blueberry field. 100 little promises set in peat, waiting for a place to lay down roots. Frank eyed them with both wonder and worry as he carefully tended them, not knowing whether he would find a place to suit these little ones. But he also found comfort in the timing. His Heavenly Father knew what he and these little ones needed, and he saw fit to let them begin that journey right now. He would be the one to give them both a home. All right, thanks for listening. Have an awesome day.